In the spring of 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were rubble, factories silent, roads broken, and rail lines shattered. The war's end brought not peace, but a desperate hunger. With fields left and tilled, machinery destroyed, and fertilizer scarce, agricultural production collapsed. Food could not be grown. What remained could not be moved. The once rich landscape of farms and villages offered almost nothing. In towns across Germany, civilians emerged from bombed-out shelters to confront a sorrowful reality. Pantries were nearly empty. Bread, when it came, was thin and coarse. Families with children pooled their rations, trying to stretch every scrap as far as possible. In many places, daily calories averaged between 600 and 1,000, far below what was needed to sustain health. Simple staples like sugar, milk, and meat were rarities. Black markets became a grim but necessary lifeline. Millions of displaced persons crowded into the western zones. Refugees fleeing from the eastern territories, survivors of forced labor, and families who had lost everything. The chaos of wartime displacement now merged with the crisis of starvation. Former urban dwellers found themselves in the countryside, and former farmers returned only to find their farms destroyed, their fields barren. Among the most vulnerable were children. With parents weak and food scarce, many youngsters became painfully thin. In some places, mothers whispered about children who fainted, who could no longer cry, or who simply curled up in hunger. Older people too struggled. They rationed to the point of exhaustion, walking long distances in winter snow just to reach occasional soup kitchens. The occupying authorities recognized the scale of the catastrophe. Relief efforts began. Agricultural machinery was repaired, fertilizer production restarted, and German workers, including former soldiers and POWs, were put to work on the land. Food imports, seeds, and fuel were shipped into Germany to provide urgent relief. Aid agencies established feeding centers. Medical teams treated the malnourished, and local officials helped rebuild rudimentary distribution networks. Yet despite those efforts, the suffering was profound. Hospitals overflowed with patients ravaged by hunger-related disease. People used coal and broken furniture for fuel. Families bartered old possessions for a handful of flour. Survival became a full-time struggle. Every morning brought the same question: where will the next meal come from? In this bleak landscape, Germany's moral and political identity was tested. A nation that had waged war now wrestled with its own ruined body. The hunger years had begun, years when securing food was not just a logistical challenge, but a human rights imperative. For ordinary Germans, the war's end was not a victory, but a fragile moment of survival. The battle for their lives had only just begun. In the early months after Germany's surrender in 1945, few civilians expected mercy from the foreign soldiers now marching through their shattered towns. Rumors had spread for years that the Americans were harsh, that they would take revenge, that no help would come. Yet when the first American convoys rolled into ruined villages, what many Germans saw was not an occupying force, but exhausted young men carrying crates of food, medical supplies, and blankets. The American troops arriving in the western zones were confronted with devastation unlike anything they had imagined. Roads were clogged with refugees. Children wandered in thin coats, searching for scraps. Entire neighborhoods had no functioning water or electricity. What struck the soldiers most was the hunger, deep, visible, almost silent. In the countryside, families survived on watery soup and small pieces of dark bread. In the cities, many had gone days without a proper meal. Commanders quickly realized that occupation alone was impossible unless civilians were kept alive. Units were instructed to secure food warehouses, protect ration depots, and prevent looting. In many towns, soldiers organized emergency feeding stations, using their own field kitchens to prepare soup for crowds that lined up quietly, bowls and tin cups in hand. Some troops emptied their personal rations into piles for local children, unable to watch them starve. American medical officers inspected schools and orphanages, shocked by the thin faces and frail bodies of youngsters. They ordered immediate deliveries of milk powder, vitamin tablets, and protein-rich rations. Army engineers repaired water pumps, cleared roads for supply trucks, and reopened storage facilities so that relief shipments could flow. For many German civilians, the moment of transformation happened not with grand speeches, but in simple encounters. A soldier handing a chocolate bar to a child who had forgotten the taste of sweetness. A truck driver unloading flour at a bakery that had been cold for months. A medic wrapping blankets around an elderly woman who had collapsed from hunger. These gestures began to chip away at years of fear and propaganda. At the same time, the American forces established strict systems to stabilize daily life. They reorganized rationing, reactivated agricultural services, and supervised local administrators to ensure fair distribution. Allied directives demanded that food production be restored as quickly as possible. Farmers received tools and fertilizer, while rail lines were repaired to reopen supply routes. The goal was clear: prevent famine and rebuild the foundation for recovery. Despite strict policies, many soldiers acted out of simple humanity. Diaries and military reports describe moments where troops went beyond orders, sharing surplus meals with families, carrying sick children to field hospitals, or helping rebuild homes in their off-duty hours. These actions, though unofficial, formed some of the earliest bridges between former enemies. As the weeks passed, German civilians began to see the Americans not as conquerors, but as unexpected protectors. Trust grew gradually, shaped by the realization that the soldiers' arrival had stopped the free fall toward starvation. Children who had once hidden at the sight of foreign uniforms now gathered near the checkpoints, hoping for biscuits or canned meat. Parents watched with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief as the same army that had once been feared now provided the lifelines that kept their families alive. The arrival of American troops became a turning point, a moment when survival, dignity, and human compassion began to return to a broken nation. In the shadows of war's destruction, the seeds of recovery were planted not with weapons, but with bread, blankets, and unexpected kindness. In the summer of 1945, hunger shaped every hour of life in post-war Germany. Rations were scarce, distribution systems were fragile, and the caloric levels available to civilians fell far below what was needed for survival. In many towns, the daily allowance barely reached 1,000 calories, and in some urban districts it dropped even lower. Children showed signs of malnutrition: thin limbs, swollen joints, pale skin, and hospitals struggled to treat illnesses that were rooted not in infection, but in starvation. American soldiers stationed in the western zones witnessed this suffering firsthand. They had come expecting hostility, perhaps even resistance, but what they encountered instead were families standing silently in ration lines, school children collecting nettles and dandelions for soup, and exhausted mothers trading their last valuables for a handful of flour. Army reports described the situation as a slow-moving humanitarian collapse, one that could not be solved by military orders alone. The official policy of the occupying forces focused on stabilizing rationing, protecting food depots, and restoring agricultural output. But the reality on the ground pushed many soldiers to act far beyond official guidelines. Units began sharing parts of their own rations: canned meat, dried eggs, powdered milk, biscuits, and chocolate bars to supplement what civilians received. These individual acts were rarely recorded formally, yet they became lifelines for countless families. Field kitchens often became informal gathering points. After troops finished their meals, cooks would distribute leftover soup or pieces of bread to waiting civilians. Some soldiers pooled their rations, intentionally skipping items they could live without, so that children in nearby villages could receive more substantial meals. Engineers and medics joined the effort, delivering surplus supplies to orphanages and hospitals where malnutrition was most severe. In many communities, relationships formed around these small exchanges. A soldier handing a child a can of fruit often learned the child's name the next day. Families left handwritten notes of thanks, sometimes in broken English, sometimes with simple drawings. These gestures did not erase the devastation of war, but they created moments of trust, moments when survival felt possible again. The American military also organized more structured relief efforts. They supported the reopening of bakeries by providing flour and fuel. They helped local farmers repair equipment and access fertilizer so more food could be grown before winter. They arranged transport so supplies could reach places cut off by destroyed bridges or blocked roads. Step by step, these efforts strengthened the fragile food system, turning emergency aid into a path toward recovery. Children were often the focus of these actions. Medical surveys showed dangerously high malnutrition rates among the young, prompting American officers to prioritize milk powder and high-protein foods for schools and youth centers. In some towns, soldiers helped run feeding programs where hundreds of children received warm meals each day. Many youngsters would later recall that these meals were the first truly filling portions they had tasted in months. The effect of these efforts was not just physical, but emotional. Families who had braced themselves for starvation began to regain hope. Civilians who once avoided American patrols started greeting them openly. The image of an occupying army slowly shifted in the public mind to that of neighbors who shared what they had. Though the large-scale recovery of Germany would take many more years, the simple act of sharing rations became one of the earliest signs that the country's descent into famine could be stopped. In countless small towns and cities, life was preserved not by grand strategy, but by everyday compassion, by soldiers offering pieces of their own meals so that strangers might see another day. In the months following Germany's surrender, something unexpected unfolded in the dust-filled streets and bombed-out squares. Tears, not of triumph, but of relief and profound gratitude. German civilians, long taught to fear and hate the Americans, broke down when they realized that these foreign soldiers were not simply conquerors, but lifelines. Women crouched beside field kitchens, clutching their children tightly as they received bowls of warm soup. The faces of their infants, gaunt from weeks of starvation, softened at the smell of food. For many, it was the first hot meal in months, delivered not by their own, but by those who had once seemed distant and menacing. In those moments, the war's propaganda lines collapsed. One elderly man, standing in a ration line, folded his hands and whispered a broken Danke, his voice trembling. A young mother wept openly, her tears mixing with gratitude as she watched a soldier gently hand her a can of powdered milk. Children looked up with wide eyes when GIs offered them chocolate or biscuits. Small gifts, but monumental. These weren't just acts of charity. They were powerful symbols of compassion. These small interactions sparked a moral awakening. For the occupied population, the sight of American soldiers patiently distributing food challenged the narrative of the enemy. It wasn't brutality or revenge they found. It was kindness. The very people they had been told to hate were feeding their children. That realization shattered deep-seated prejudices, and many Germans quietly shifted how they saw their occupiers. Soldiers, too, were changed. At first, they followed orders, distributing rations, opening field kitchens, helping rebuild infrastructure. But as they saw the desperation around them, the hollow cheeks of children, the weary lines of mothers, they acted with more than duty. In personal letters and unofficial reports, they wrote of being moved. Some stayed after their shifts to hold dying children. Others carried extra bread and cans in their packs to give away when they could. Commanders couldn't ignore the moral weight of what was happening. Military leaders recognized that feeding civilians was not only a strategic necessity, but a point of human connection. Aid programs were gradually expanded. More food, more milk, more protein-rich rations reached orphanages, hospitals, and makeshift shelters. In towns devastated by war, American engineers fixed water pumps, reopened wells, and rebuilt scattered food depots. Meanwhile, local German officials and community leaders began to cooperate, overcoming decades of suspicion in order to share relief. The simple act of sharing food became a bridge between two people who had just come out of terrible violence. As gratitude spread, so did a fragile but growing trust. People who had once hidden from uniformed patrols began to greet soldiers openly. Mothers left scraps of bread their children couldn't eat in donated crates as silent thanks. In schools and orphanages, children who had known only hunger now held tin cups filled with nourishing cocoa. Those who lived through those days later recalled how deeply the memories cut. Not just the physical relief of a full stomach, but the emotional healing of being seen, cared for, and valued. In a broken country reeling from years of war and deprivation, these gestures became a foundation for rebuilding. Not just houses, but humanity itself. In the final years of the war, Germans had been taught to see the Americans as monsters, ruthless enemies who would bring only destruction. But by late 1945, in towns where hunger overshadowed fear, that image began to crumble. What replaced it was not admiration at first, but shock. The realization that the foreign soldiers now walking their streets were treating them not as conquered foes, but as fellow human beings. For many civilians, the moment of transformation came quietly. A young American medic kneeling beside an elderly German man collapsed from exhaustion. A group of soldiers helping rebuild a collapsed roof so a family could survive the winter. A GI setting down his rifle to lift a starving child into a field truck headed for a medical station. These small, human gestures carried far more power than speeches or orders. In villages where tension had once been high, American officers began meeting with local leaders to rebuild community life. They assisted mayors with ration distribution, encouraged schools to reopen, and ensured that the most vulnerable children, the elderly, widows, received priority food allotments. Through these efforts, The image of the American soldier shifted from that of an occupier to that of a protector. The most profound changes took place in the minds of the German people. Many had never spoken to an American before, yet now they found themselves sharing stories with the very men they had once feared. Mothers told soldiers about the nights spent hiding from bombings. Farmers explained how their fields had been destroyed and their livestock lost. Children, timid at first, slowly approached the soldiers who offered them small gifts: an apple, a candy bar, a tin of meat. The Americans, for their part, were also changed. Some arrived with hardened views shaped by the brutal battles they had survived. But seeing the suffering of civilians, families shivering in unheated rooms, people waiting hours in ration lines, orphans wandering the ruins, stirred empathy they had not expected to feel. Letters written home spoke of this awakening. The realization that the people they had fought were not faceless enemies, but ordinary families who had been swept into a war none of them fully controlled. Joint efforts gradually fostered cooperation. German workers, under Allied guidance, restored water systems and transportation routes. American engineers helped rebuild hospitals and rail lines. Relief trains carrying food and fuel arrived regularly, with soldiers unloading supplies alongside local volunteers. Each shared task strengthened the fragile bond growing between former enemies. By early 1946, the atmosphere in many towns had changed dramatically. Civilians greeted patrols with nods instead of fear. Children waved at trucks driving by. Local officials worked closely with military administrators, no longer as adversaries, but as partners. Trust, once unimaginable, was now an everyday reality. This shift did not erase the horrors of the war, nor did it ignore the deep wounds on both sides. But it created a path forward, a way for people who had been taught to hate one another to rebuild a shared sense of humanity. For countless Germans, the Americans' willingness to help feed them, shelter them, and protect them during the darkest months after the war marked the beginning of a long healing process. In the end, what bridged the divide between the former enemies was not political strategy or military authority, but simple compassion. Meals shared in field kitchens, blankets offered on freezing nights, hands extended across the rubble. These acts reminded both sides that beneath the uniforms and national identities were human beings capable of kindness. From the ruins of war, a fragile but genuine understanding emerged, that even in the aftermath of unimaginable devastation, humanity could be rediscovered one act of mercy at a time.